Okay, so last night I finally got the chance to sit down and watch the video we were supposed to watch in regards to the 60s. And basically everybody described it as a time of self-indulgence, the best time to be alive, which does make it sound positive and happy and exciting. But on top of all of this self-awareness and freedoms that these people were fighting for, there was also the Vietnam War going on. You had people fighting for racial equality. There was rebellion everywhere, and a lot of people described it as a loss of innocence within that generation. And that's something that really actually helped me out, because I'm not only in American literature, but I do also have a history class as well. And I actually just wrote my essay over civil rights and didn't realize that during this time, you had people like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, people like that that were fighting for civil rights. So I didn't realize that all of this tied in together. So the video was actually very helpful, not only in this class, but also in my history class as well. But anyways, there were 500,000 soldiers deployed by 1970 for the Vietnam War. And at first, a lot of people accepted it. They thought that it was necessary to prevent communism from taking over in the United States. But after years, there was bloodshed. People were coming home injured. They were dying. By 1967, you had a lot of people that were rebelling, especially young people in general. And that's where you do get onto the topic of hippies coming about. And so this was a really big time for music, like we read in the poem Howl. You had a lot of sexual freedom going on, and that was mostly due to the invention of birth control during that time. You also had music that was coming about, like the Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, things that we still listen to today, so that also kind of ties into our generation as well. And then you also had people experiencing with drugs, things like that. So in the poem Howl, it was described as a generation that was basically ruining itself, but it was just mass chaos. I mean, you had the war going on, the racial inequality, things like that. You had rebellions. So people were basically just going crazy, living for the moment, because they didn't know when it would be over or if it would ever be over. So there was also a political movement. You had people that were peacefully trying to end the war in Vietnam that was unsuccessful. And then they also described it as having a consciousness movement. You had people all around becoming self-aware, realizing that they do have to live for today because tomorrow isn't promised, and especially with the war and things like that. But then you also had the Summer of Love. Like I mentioned earlier, you had Hendrix, people like the Beatles, bands like that were coming about, and they basically sang about anti-war, basically the typical hippie appearance, everything that you would think of today as being a hippie. That's basically what it was all about. It all revolved around this Summer of Love, where you had people rebelling and arguing against the war and just kind of having a good time doing what they wanted, sex, drugs, rock and roll, things like that. But then also, the thing that really stuck out to me the most was they started talking about the civil rights, and you had this group called the Black Panther. And it was basically a group of African Americans who were angry with the police. They felt like they were very racist at the time, which I'm sure they were. You were still having issues with segregation, inequality, things like that. But there were all kinds of riots that were started, and that kind of reminds me of today and some of the things that we still see in today's society. For example, you had the Ferguson riot going on, people who are angry at police because they felt like there was some kind of racial inequality going on in the decisions that were made by police officers. And then not only that, but just recently you have all these riots going on in Baltimore over the same kind of issues. So it still kind of ties into today's generation. So during that time you had, like I mentioned, a lot of young people who were rebelling, especially college students in general. And my critical question for the week would probably be this. I mean, you had all these college students who were peacefully just doing sit-down riots. They weren't being violent about it or anything. And then you had the police coming in, and there was a lot of police brutality towards the college students. And it just kind of makes me wonder if maybe there was an alternative motive, if they were trying to hide the reasons behind the war, if, you know, I'm not sure if maybe the police were working with the government in ways that they would support the war. So I just don't understand why they had these peaceful sit-downs and marches, and they were just expressing their point of view, why the police had to come in and be so brutal about it. So that just makes me wonder about their intentions as far as the war goes. Because I did hear in the video somewhere that President Lyndon Johnson, he ended up quitting, but it said somewhere towards the beginning that maybe the reasons for beginning the war in Vietnam, there was a lie behind it, something like that. I didn't really get into details of it, didn't really search it up, but it does make me wonder the intentions. So that would probably be my critical question, to just consider why these peaceful marches and things like that were approached with violence.